Oh, baby. I think this one is going to be a spicy one. I've not watched it. Came up in the algorithm yesterday. It is a year old, so maybe he's changed his takes by now, but I want to see it through. I feel like it's a bad take already, but I'm going to give it a fair chance. So let's not waste any time. Let's get into it. I want to preface the video by saying I am not a TDD nut job. I don't think we need 100% unit test coverage, but there is a lot of value in unit tests, and I want to understand why he doesn't think there is.
Let's talk about unit tests and why I don't use them.
Bold.
I know that's a bold
Real
statement,
bold.
but I don't have much a use case for unit tests in the vast majority of the things that I build.
And I think that might be a key theme, a key piece of context throughout the whole video is that in the things that he builds, it feels like it's already quite a vastly front-end heavy take. Might be wrong. I'm not a big believer, I'm not a big doer of like having state in the front end. I don't believe we should really have much logic in the front end either. You know, I understand that's like very contradictory for modern web applications, but it's just how I feel about it. And maybe that's a big part of this take, but we'll hear about it a little bit more. It's only been 16 seconds.
And I think that when I say that, my take gets seen as some crazy rebellious person who only works on small teams and is more than happy to go break things for all 5 of my users.
If anything, small teams are probably where you need unit tests the most. You want to give yourself security that changes that you make maybe don't get opportunity to be fully reviewed, and your processes maybe aren't as mature. Yeah.
But this is actually the same take that, funny enough, some other big companies have. One of my favorites, and I need to go find the tweet quick. Quote tweeted it because it was really good. Aha. Here. Wanted to go find this tweet because, as I said, it's a banger. Somebody went on a rant about like eng culture coming from one company to another, and a Facebook engineer had a test that was preventing a change from happening, so he deleted the test and got back to work, because tests are only there to block engineers. That is the only role of tests.
I want to put a point there. This is a terrible take. Absolutely not. They will slow you down because you have to build a test. They're not there to primarily block engineers. If something's not working, it's the classic meme, right? Delete the test and move on. It's a cultural thing. And just, you know, kind of what the test is saying, it's a cultural thing. If you're not thinking, you don't have the same mindset, you're not approaching the problem in the same way, it's likely that people aren't going to bother fixing the tests. And if you're not running the tests, then that's how you get broken tests, right?
And
because they've not been run and you don't know that they're failing, so you commit the work and then blah, 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 blah.
And in this engineer's 5 years at Facebook, they have never written a single test. It was cheaper to test in prod and forward fix. What you need to know is that it wasn't a 0 to 100% of infra in one day. It was tiered, monitored with an SRE team watching as things go out.
Exactly. That was exactly what I was about to say. It's not, I think, working somewhere like a FANG company or somewhere with a big engineering department is probably more of an argument to not do tests or to not spend as much time on tests, because there's so much infra, there's so much monitoring, there's so many other teams that are aware, there's so many more people on hand to do fixing. So it's kind of more of a bias against not doing it than, yeah, that is. It's like confirming the bias already, this take.
Unit tests are designed to slow you down. That is not necessarily a bad thing. There are a lot of places.
They're not designed to slow you down. They will slow you down, but they're not designed to slow you down.
Where slowing your engineers down to make sure everything is always the exact way you expect can make sense. Like if you're doing like financial bank software to make sure transactions are being processed correctly on the back end, those types of things should probably have unit tests, as well as a shitload of integration end-to-end tests.
I agree, but I don't think it's just financial transactions. I think anything that's transactional should be tested, because if you're in a scenario where you can't re-roll transactions, which majority of like the web products that a lot of developers work on these days aren't going to have that facility. They're not going to be able to re-roll transactions if something's gone wrong. That's where you retain the value, right? Like if you don't have a time machine and you aren't able to go back to a certain point of time, then you need to be sure that the input turns into the desired output and is logged to the right tables, ends up in the right place. Whether it's just a really simple transaction that you're putting something in a database, doesn't necessarily matter what the contents of that transaction is. If it's transactional, it should be unit tested if there's any form of testable logic in there.
That all said, if you're building applications for users, the application breaking slightly and then being fixed when you've identified that break is almost always cheaper. And if it's not cheaper, that's the thing you should be focused on.
Cheaper to who?
Fixing. I've helped a lot of teams, companies.
Cheap is so subjective, right? If you are building an application in-house for a client, for an agency, like the cost is really subjective, and I would argue that it's not cheaper. If you're in a position where you can't re-roll and you've lost out on sales, you've lost out on customer data, depending on what your business is, depending on what your transactions are. If you're working on a platform where your website doesn't display the right checkbox, or your service doesn't respond with the right thing, and it's not mission critical, and it isn't something that is going to have a direct impact on the business, the core business, the core operations, then yeah, maybe you can get away with saying, oh, look, there's a first line support of raised this bug, we got to jump on and fix it. That's such a terrible argument against not having a safety net there in the first place.
These individual engineers find ways to be more productive without being more destructive, to be frank. And the best ways don't tend to be testing at all. And if they are, they're integration into end testing. Unit testing is a way to set up a guardrail at every possible turn when developers are the ones whose job is to make the path. You cannot predict every path somebody might go down, so your unit tests are going to block important paths inherently, just by...
No, you absolutely can. Like, that's the whole point. If anything, you can't do like a gold standard end-to-end test because you can't predict all the paths necessarily. But if you've got a unit, it sounds like to me he's trying to unit test the wrong type of code. Because if you have a unit that is written in an approach, and that's why I think a lot of people that are big on unit tests are big on TDD, is because doing TDD will allow you, will ensure that you write code that's testable. You can't just unit test any code. That's just a given. If you are in a position where you write code that isn't unit testable, your only option is to do integration tests, is to do end-to-end tests, because you can't test those units. And I think often in modern day web development especially, we're using so many frameworks, we're using so many plugins, so many things that are already tested by other people. There's this like this laziness that we kind of, or maybe it's even unnecessary to try and test those things, A, because they've been tested by other people, but B, because really all you're doing is the plumbing. And end-to-end tests and unit and integration tests are that. They're testing the plumbing. If you're not writing anything with any value that does anything meaningful, then yeah, don't unit test it. But that's not saying don't unit test at all. That just means that it's not applicable to the code that you're writing.
Existing. I don't think senior developers, engineer leads, team leads, all of the people who make these technical decisions, certainly not like CTOs and such, should be enforcing code coverage numbers for unit tests, because that is enforcing people to build guardrails instead of building paths. Nope. And if a path isn't put in the right place and somebody missteps and falls, you should be focused on building a good safety net. And I think that's the core of my testing philosophy. Don't build guardrails, build safety nets.
Unit tests
Make it
are
as cheap
safety
as
nets.
possible to fail. So if something does go wrong in prod, you can revert it really quickly and fix it even quicker. Our time to respond to a bug at ping, like when somebody reports an issue to us, our average response time is a decent bit under 7 minutes for a production fix, because we have optimized the hell out of our pipe. So once an issue is reported to us, we can identify it fast and fix it even faster.
Again, really subjective. I think the product that he mainly built, or they mainly build at Ping, is is plumbing, right? Like I was talking about, it's a service that wraps S3, essentially an S3 wrapper. They probably do have some like proprietary logic, some proprietary value in there, which I believe probably should be unit tested. But depending on the way that they've built it, if it is just plumbing, there's probably not much room for that. And talking about optimizing a pipe, that's kind of like it's a bit of a red herring. It's a bit of a distraction because it's kind of irrelevant. Like it doesn't matter how quickly you can get your from problem reported to problem fixed. The guardrail, I think he's got the wrong interpretation of what a unit test is. A unit test is a safety net.
That is so much more important than any number of unit tests can be. And it doesn't cost our engineers more. In fact, the things that we did to make it that fast help our engineers every day.
It does, because they still have to fix the issues. It still costs more. It's just costing more later rather than at the beginning.
On anything that they're working on. The value of not unit testing is that the time you would spend unit testing can be spent doing all of the other things our teams, our users, and our engineers.
How long has it taken to write a unit test? Jeez.
Want and need. And by making our environment as fast as possible, it is now safer to make mistakes, but more importantly, our engineers are less scared. They don't worry about writing the right number of tests or when.
Again, that's a cultural thing. That isn't about writing the right. They're more worried about the reporting structure and the way things are outlined and the rules there are that are cultural. Nothing to do with the engineering. Nothing to do with building an actual valuable test. If your tests aren't valuable, then don't write them. If the code's not testable, then you've probably gone wrong in your implementation.
And a test is failing for some reason, they don't worry about like deleting it and finding the right conditions. Tests are poorly placed guardrails. Please build safety nets instead. I've seen so many code bases by like a 10-person team that take 20 minutes to deploy and have 80 to 90 to 100% even code coverage. And that does not make a productive work environment. I've seen 4-person teams hiring DevOps because they have dug themselves into such deep holes instead of keeping things simple. And unit tests are one of those things where if they're not solving a specific problem for you, you probably shouldn't be writing them at all.
That's such an anecdote. Really not much meaningful information in that statement whatsoever. Obviously, if there's not a value in building a test, don't write the test. But you probably not got value in the test because of the way that you've approached the implementation of the code.
So I hope that helps people better understand my stance on unit testing and why I don't really bother doing it. We've been keeping track at Ping, actually. We have a list of the bugs that hit production that a unit test theoretically could have caught. And in our year of operation, we're at 3. And of those 3, 2 of them, absolutely we never would have written the test for. They were very strange edge cases that were like maybe an integration test might have caught. But like theoretically, we could have written a unit test that caught those things. But the reality is the problems we run into are not ones that unit tests realistically would have been testing for.
Because it's plumbing.
On top of that, a lot of the problems I used to have that unit tests help for were things that TypeScript has solved. So for the 80% window of tests making sure valid inputs and outputs are happening, TypeScript does that. And for the other 20%,
valid inputs and outputs when your unit only. He's talking about type safety. And that's not what the reason for building a unit test. If you're putting something into an object or a function, it should probably come out different. Otherwise, what's the point in running the function? You're not just testing that the right type of data is going in and coming out. It's actually what comes out of it.
I feel like you're going to run into those bugs anyways. So making it easy to fix them when you do is way higher a priority for me, almost always. But Theo, we have this one path in our code base that's super fragile and it keeps breaking. So we have lots of unit tests making sure it doesn't break. Cool, I guess. Like if nobody ever wants to touch that and you've put those unit tests in to kind of like cement it in stone so that no one will ever touch it again, great. You did your job. You took this thing that barely works and you duct taped and cemented it in place so it can't ever move, so it's less likely to break. But I would have spent that time rebuilding the thing, not covering it in cement so it can't ever move again.
That's a 2-part problem. One, it sounds like the flaky service, let's just call it a service, is in a position where it's flaky. But to have safety, to have what's the right word? To have like reassurance that refactoring that flaky service is still going to have the same output at the end of the refactor than it did at the beginning, then you're probably going to need unit tests, because you're going to want security. You're going to want the safety net that he keeps alluding to allow you, not to keep you locked in stone. You shouldn't be testing for, well, I mean, you need to be testing for what it does. Obviously, there is like a certain set of like business rules around what it is you're testing, but it's not to cement it there. It's to give you the flexibility to refactor it and to make sure that just because you change the implementation of your tests when you change your service potentially doesn't mean that that's fixing it. You as long as you still get the valid outputs, then you kind of done the job, right? But it does sound like maybe this hypothetical service isn't really in a shape where it can be tested.
Like if something is fragile, the time spent reinforcing it with unit tests to double or more the amount of code just to make sure that thing doesn't break again is time you could almost always have spent rewriting the thing so it's less fragile in the first place.
The test is never going to stop it from breaking again. The tests they're not there at runtime, are they? They're going to just make sure that anything that you change doesn't break it when you go to build it. It also, a lot of this, talking about optimizing a pipe, like getting code into production and making sure that you don't break it. If something's fragile, it means, if you don't change something, it's not going to just suddenly break unless you start putting vastly different things into it, and then you end up getting different things out of it, or it doesn't know how to handle those different things. So you're not cementing anything with the unit test. You're ensuring that it's still doing what it should do. Maybe you weren't sure what it should do in the first place.
So with all that said, I hope you understand why.
Yeah, I think I've had enough. It's fundamentally, I believe this is a bad take. My takeaway from it, or my advice to you would be make sure that you're testing any sort of business logic, any sort of complex stuff, any complex functionality that you know what comes into it and what goes out of it. Don't try and unit test your plumbing. Make sure you've got good integration tests. Anything that's transactional needs to be tested. Anything you can't re-roll, anything that you can't go back in time and redo again, needs to have as much security around it as possible, not just for the runtime operations, but for when you do inevitably have to refactor it in the future. Let me know your experience with testing. Let me know your approach. Let me know if you agree with this take or my take, or what your thoughts are in the comments. If you made it this far, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.